Okay, welcome to, I believe it's our 17th session for Society of the Spectacle. And last meeting, we actually finished reading the book, but we didn't really have time to get into the last chapter, chapter 9, in much detail. So I'm going to just sort of quickly go through that last chapter, which is a difficult chapter. It's pretty dense. Um, and then we'll have, any questions you might have about that. And then when we're done talking about that, we're going to look back over the whole book and see if people have any particular questions or issues that we'd like to talk about there. So this chapter is called Ideology Materialized, and the epigraph is from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. It says self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself only insofar as it exists in and for another self-consciousness. That is, it exists only by being recognized. At the risk of oversimplifying, basically he's saying that a real self, a real full person, to be a full person, you have to be recognized and you have to recognize others. I mean, it's kind of a reciprocal thing there. Otherwise, you're not really fulfilling yourself. And so, of course, that is leading into his main thesis of this whole book, is that in this society, among various other kinds of alienations, one way of looking at it is that we are prevented from that kind of recognition, mutual recognition relationship. Um, the way things work is that individuals are sort of objectified or et cetera, et cetera. So then in the actual text, uh, I'm not going to reread all these things, but the gist of the first thesis here is that the spectacle has what he calls materialized ideology. Ideology has always been, in the sense that Debord and Marx talk about it, a kind of separate thought. It's a thought that has some rigidification to it, some falsification, and so on. But as he points out in this thesis, it's also partly based on reality. It's sort of something about reality, but it gets sort of perverted or limited or something like this. And he's saying in the society of the spectacle, this limitation becomes not just kind of a thing out there that somebody is lying about something or this. It actually ends up pervading the whole society, pervading our world, our life. And this kind of separation deal is, we can hardly get away from it because if we walk out the door, the very buildings, the very billboards, the very media, all these various things are themselves sort of lies, themselves sort of, are inhibiting us in various ways. So that's kind of the gist of what he's talking about in these actually these first three theses. So let's see what I want to do. I want to skip ahead to numbers 216, which is an interesting one. Here he talks about Marx's theses on Feuerbach, a very brief text that Marx wrote early in his career, where Marx looks at Feuerbach as this sort of fellow materialist, but he's saying that Feuerbach's materialism, although it represented an advance, it sort of has a kind of passive element to it. He's saying that things are material, but he's not recognizing or taking into account the active nature that we need to do this. So Marx is in this thesis. He sums up the theses on Feuerbach, saying the realization of philosophy in a praxis transcending the opposition between idealism and materialism. And he's saying that in contrast to that, the spectacle keeps those separations going. So the contemplative aspect of old materialism is sort of reflected in the spectacle, which turns everybody into passive spectators of a world that's out there. And then there's an active aspect with idealism. He says, conversely, the dreamed activity of idealism is also fulfilled in the spectacle through the technical mediation of signs and signals, which ultimately materialize an abstract ideal. I know this is very difficult to understand, but if you look at that, his whole point here is that there's this disconnect, which ideology means. Things are not, the words or the thought does not match reality in some way. And that disconnect has now been it's pervaded the whole society, so that instead of ideology just being something you could refute and say that person's lying, it's not like that, it's like this. Instead, when you look around, you would have to say the whole world is lying. That building is a lie. That lifestyle is a lie, etc. So, Bill, you've got a question. Unmute yourself, please.
Throughout this whole section, am I unmuted? Yeah. He uses the word concrete throughout. In the first, the concrete success, autonomized system, etc. It's sort of a specialized use that it seems derives from Hegel, I guess. He seems that it's not just materialized success, or I was wondering what he's getting at, because he repeats it throughout the this chapter.
Yeah. Well, again, that's the whole point of this chapter, which culminates, it's like the end of the book, so it kind of sums up the whole book, is that you have concrete things and abstract things, and they need to be related with each other. Abstract things are fine. We have to talk abstractly sometimes about generalities. And we're also in a world made of concrete things. We can't ignore the actual realities, but we can't. So we recognize that it's different, but also a problem is that if they're kept different, so that some people, for example, specialize in thinking and other people specialize in moving stuff around physically or doing physical things, there's the division there. And so I don't know. This stuff is very hard to explain. I think these next 5 theses after this are a little bit more concrete, because they talk about people's states of mind that we can relate to. So I think we'll go on here. He talks about this book by Joseph Gabel called False Consciousness. That's the English translation of the book. It's a French book. And in this book, Gabel relates ideology to psychological fuck-ups like schizophrenia or various other things like that. He says they're kind of parallel to that. So this is a little bit like what Wilhelm Reich was doing. And so then Debord goes on to say there's this fracturing of practice and consciousness in every moment of everyday life, subjected to the spectacle. And this is reflected, or it causes the subjects, the people that are caught in this weird world, to, it destroys the faculty of encounter. That was Gabel's phrase. It means it destroys the capacity to relate to each other in a full sense of the term, and replaces it with a social hallucination, a false consciousness of encounter, an illusion of encounter, where you think you're meeting somebody or even something, but really you aren't. You know, it's just kind of a figment. You and the other being you're supposedly relating with are both kind of fooling yourself. There's miscommunication and so on. He says, in a society where no one can any longer be recognized by others, each individual becomes incapable of recognizing his own reality. Ideology is at home. Separation has built its own world. Then he goes on to another quote by Gabel. In clinical accounts of schizophrenia, says Gabel, the deterioration of the dialectic of totality, with dissociation as its extreme form, and the deterioration of the dialectic of becoming, with catatonia as its extreme form, seem closely interrelated, unquote. So Gabel is saying there's two dialectics that are, you might say, are sort of good things, healthy things, or necessary things. One is totality, that you have a view of the whole, you relate to the whole. The other is a view of becoming, in other words, change. You have whole, which could be a static whole, and then you have change, the fact that things are evolving all the time and changing from one thing to another. And each of us in our lives has to know how to deal with those things, which we do sort of automatically. And he's saying that when those deteriorate, the dialectic of totality and the dialectic of becoming, they become these psychological screw-ups, namely a dialectic of totality where you want to get the whole becomes related with dissociation. In other words, where you're pulled apart, you're disconnected with things, as opposed, or disconnected from things, or disconnected within yourself, as opposed to having some unitary relation with the world. And as far as becoming, the being okay with things changing, flowing, and so on, if you're blocked off from that, then you get catatonia, which is the kind of thing where you're just sort of frozen. I can't do anything. I can't move. This is crazy. It's all chaos and I don't know what I'm going to do. So I'll just retreat to this thing where I just freeze. And these are kind of two extreme examples of the kind, people who are in mental hospitals get to this kind of thing. And Gabel is saying that similar things happen in society in relation to ideologies, that you have people or whole groups of people that will not relate to the whole. They'll divide it down and then they'll be all fragmented and so on. Or they will not relate to change. They don't get it that things evolve or life evolves or something, and they just freeze. I mean, maybe they freeze, for example, by saying, I was taught this and I'm not going to change. My father and mother told me this, and it's always been done this way. And in the good old days, it was like that. And they're freaked out that some new thing might come in. So, welcome, Gary. I don't know if you were planning on this one. This is not our musical one. Anyway, so I'm going to continue there with that one. So, he says, imprisoned in a flattened universe bounded by the screen of the spectacle behind which his own life has been exiled, the spectator's consciousness no longer knows anyone but the fictitious interlocutors, that means people you talk with, who subject him to a one-way monologue about their commodities and the politics of their commodities. So a little later on here, individuals who passively accept their subjection to an alien everyday reality are thus driven toward a madness that reacts to that fate by resorting to illusory magical techniques, gimmicks. It doesn't have to be literally magic. The essence of this pseudo-response to an unanswerable communication is acceptance and consumption of commodities. The consumer's compulsion to imitate is a truly infantile need, conditioned by all the aspects of his fundamental dispossession. As Gabel puts it, describing a different level of pathology, the abnormal need for representation here makes up for a torturing feeling of being on the edge of existence. And I'll just get the last two theses here. He says, a, a critique that wants to go beyond the spectacle has to be a true critique. It must struggle in practice among the irreconcilable enemies of the spectacle and admit that it is nothing without them. Like you can't just have an abstract thing without people doing something. By rushing into sordid reformist compromises or pseudo-revolutionary collective actions, those driven by an abstract desire for immediate effectiveness are in reality obeying the ruling laws of thought, adopting a perspective that can see nothing but the latest news. In this way, delirium reappears within the camp that claims to be opposing it. A critique that seeks to go beyond the spectacle must know how to wait. And finally, the self-emancipation of our time is an emancipation from the material basis of internal inverted truth. This historical mission can be carried out neither by the isolated individual nor by atomized and manipulated masses, but only and always by the class that is able to dissolve all classes by reducing all power to the de-alienating form of realized democracy, to councils in which practical theory implements itself and surveys its own actions. Only there are individuals directly linked to world history, there where dialogue has armed itself to impose its own conditions. So, any questions? Again, I know this is difficult and we won't be able to, but maybe if there's one or two things you have here, I can try to. See. Bill, are you raising your hand?
His idea of what are examples of ideologies? He seems to mention materialism and idealism, but he also says that in 215, the spectacle is the epitome of ideology because it exposes and manifests the essence of all ideological systems, and that's the enslavement and negation of real life.
Right.
So idealism and materialism enslave, is that, or are we thinking of other ideologies like
I mean, there's all kinds of ideologies. He's in that thesis you're talking about, he's the Feuerbach related thing. He just picks two kinds of one-sided things, idealism and materialism, and takes them apart and shows that, they're instead of being brought together, the spectacle is sort of reproducing or reflecting their alienated aspects. But yeah, there's all indefinite numbers of ideologies. And the main thing of them is that in one way or the other, they are falsifying or rigidifying reality. They're misleading people, they're diminishing people, they're confusing people. There's all sorts of ways to look at them. It's probably good not to overthink it, like what is an basically ideologies are in the most strict sense, they're ideas about life or about things that are separated in some regard from the things themselves. And the very fact that they're separated is the main problem with them. It's not that they're false. There may be some ideologies that are relatively true, and there are other ideologies that are completely idiotic and they have nothing true about them at all. And there are subtle ideologies that are, you may remember that the Situationists early on said, there's no such thing as situationism. We reject that. And the reason is they were already back at the beginning saying, even this very liberatory set of ideas here or something, you could freeze that into an ideology, and then it becomes, negative. It's something inhibiting what people might do.
Yeah.
So I'd like to move on to our general thing, which I mentioned in the email. Is you can still ask questions about this, but I asked you to sort of think back over the book or look into the book. Was there some particular question that you had, or that you think is an important theme, or that you never quite understood about this or that, about the whole book, anything in it? And let's see if we can look at that. Mike?
I think that I read the Society of the Spectacle back in 1962, and or not 1972, I mean, and that was when I was in my 20s, obviously. So and then I reread it now, and what I missed, I mean, I got a lot. I had read Lukács, and I'd read about reification. That was new to me back in those days, and I thought it was a very important point to make out. But what reoccurred to me on rereading and studying this was the concept of cyclical time and irreversible time, and how that relates to consciousness, the consciousness of the old days of feudalism, and then through the Renaissance and Enlightenment, the days of irreversible time, and the bourgeois revolutions. And the question of time and consciousness, I think, it made me think about how time was actually conceived or perceived as being something very slow back in the further back you go, the more the perception among people about how time is slow changes as we move up to the present, where everything is absolutely at top velocity, like push button this and push button that, and change. If you can't get your point across in about 30 seconds max, then you would go on to the next screen, and that and how that affects the consciousness about being in this whirlwind of a totality, which Debord calls the spectacle, and how like what like I like to quote the old Bob Dylan song, I was so much older then, but I'm younger than that now. Well, back in the 70s, I thought, wow, if people just found out about reification, wow, if they just found out about how they've been, how the fetishism of commodities is actually, uh, you know, uh, this mystery has been solved. I'll just go out there and rationally tell them about it and everything like this, so that we'll get this snowball effect and the revolution will be over with. But the fact of the matter is that I'm like nearing 80 now, and I'm beginning to wonder if there is life outside. Where are the aliens? As Fermi said, like. If there is other life in the universe, how come they haven't landed yet or anything like that? So, uh, I still, we've got to this point where you've got a convicted felon running as a law and order candidate.
Right.
I mean, it's so absurd. It's just unbelievable. But here we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
And
the problem is that we probably could get to a classless democracy. We probably could get to the end of the spectacle if we had enough time. But the ecological
exactly.
wall
Yeah.
that we're
That's
hitting,
right. There's a race going
we've
on at
run
the
out
same
of
time.
time.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't have the time.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Back 60 or 70 years ago, we may have been worried about nuclear war or something, but we didn't think that we have a limited time. We just thought, well, we'll just postpone this another century and maybe it will happen. But
Right. I just read I read the National Security Archive is, they publish things that have just been released from the National Archives, right? And Reagan was told about the possibility of nuclear war and what it would, and the scientific evidence of what it would create. Guess what it was? Of course, as we were protesting at the time, a nuclear winter. So we are either facing a nuclear winter because of climate change, or we'll have climate change and there'll be such chaos. They'll be shooting nukes at each other, trying to deal with the problem, and then we'll have a nuclear winter. Anyway, I'll be gone anyway. But I'm not saying I like that I'm gone or anything like that. But it's I don't know what to do.
yeah, yeah. We're all in that position. Other comments or questions?
Uh,
Yes, Kim, unmute yourself.
I'll just make a comment about Mike's comment, because he's talking about climate disaster, and the Society of the Spectacle, doesn't talk very much about the environment or ecology, but there is this one line in Theses 140 where he says, the class that accumulates commodities and capital continually modifies nature by modifying labor itself, by unleashing labor's productivity. So that was one comment in the book that I thought was related to ecology.
Yeah, I might note that very soon after this book, like relatively soon, like in 1970 or 71, Debord wrote an article which he was intending to be an article for the next issue of the journal, the SI journal, and then the SI broke up. But it was called The Sick Planet.
Mm.
And in that, he really lays into it with all this stuff about pollution, population, and tying that into this. Here at this earlier stage, maybe he wasn't thinking so much of that, but actually even Marx was thinking somewhat along those lines, because that thing you quoted, I think, is just a sort of paraphrase of what something Marx said, that they alter the environment. And in some ways you can alter the environment to make it, cause people to be sick or et cetera.
Mhm.
So thanks for that. Judy, unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, as simply as possible, what do you think they mean, or Debord means by real life? You know, real life divorced from the spectacle. I mean, what would that mean?
Well, that's a good question. And it's not something you can simply answer because let's put it this way. You and I and everybody here have a life. I mean, we've managed to, we're not sitting in a coma, we're not dead. We've managed to uh, juggle various things, have relationships, accomplish various things, uh, however done. And in the process, we might uh, look at that a particular life or a particular person, and as to use the situationist terms, they might say, well, mostly we're just surviving. This life we're living is not really life. And we know what that means when we say that, because we can say, oh yeah, I'm drudging away working at this office, or I'm struggling to pay the rent, or I'm, and we're struggling to do various things. And we're saying, God, this rat race, like, what is this a life? And we would say, no. But on the other hand, almost everybody, I mean, even in very miserable circumstances, has some moments. I mean, even if you're in prison or something, maybe you meet somebody and you kind of see, you sort of click, like, oh, thank you, for helping me. Or, yeah, there's some little glimmer of something there. And in our more comfortable things, we can go out and say, well, take a walk in Tilden Park, or let's play some music together, or let's, read an interesting book, or, you have a relationship with different people as friends or lovers and so on. And to some extent, we would say, well, that is life. So then you can kind of nuance it a little bit and say, well, yeah, that's sort of life, but it's mixed in with so many of these, impediments that it doesn't really. So, you don't have to like define this like a scientific definition. We know what real life means. It's life like, wow, this is great, or it may even mean sometimes this is not great, but this is life. Nevertheless, this is worthy of, I've got a problem here, but this is a worthy problem to tackle. So that too can be life, like in the Greek tragedies and stuff like that. You have that sense that there's still, life going on and not just some sort of zombie stupid thing, like you're just turned into something, to be a body, if you're a soldier, or to, to clock in and do something that's not even worth doing, but you've got to do it to pay the rent. That would be examples of not life. So, he's using it really in a fairly normal way. There's nothing all that rocket science about it, but he's emphasizing real life, not just that you're breathing, that you're not dead yet. That's all he means. And the early
But
situation.
Ken, I mean, as opposed to being a life as influenced by the spectacle, or being like
Well,
so influenced by the spectacle that you're not having a real life.
yeah, and we are really influenced a lot in that way, which is what makes it difficult. But to some extent, we do have little margins of freedom. And even, these things are kind of dialectical. You can be in something and still, kind of see beyond it. Or if you're in something, but you're knowingly working against the problem, you're in jail, but you're trying to dig a hole, to escape or something. That itself is life. You know, that, I mean, you're doing a worthy thing that makes sense to do where you're there. Yeah, you know, it's just don't make too big a thing about, you know, there's this magical thing that's really living, and then this is not really living. These things merge together. You know, he's just seeking, like we do when we talk about this stuff, we use generalities. We say, this isn't a life. This is ridiculous. And then in other circumstances, we say, hey, oh boy, look, let's go over there. And, you know, we're just like little kids again, or whatever. So these things are changing all the time. But it's just, if we take a broad view, we can say in this society, it's not much of a life. Most of the motives are kind of stupid. You know, the main motivations are so that some billionaire can be a multi-billionaire. You know, and then that feeds into so many other things. Do we have some other comments or questions? Kirsty?
Hi, can you hear me? I'm
Yes.
having, I'm having some Zoom issues
Oh,
here. Let me see if I can get rid. Okay. Yeah, no, I want to really second like what Mike was saying, and this whole thing about time and cyclical time and irreversible time was really illuminating for me, and also kind of that getting into the, the kind of explanation of how deeply the spectacle, however we define it, is ingrained in our perceptions of things. And I was also interested in he talks about it becoming globally unified. And he says what appears to the world as the same day is merely the time of economic production, time cut up into equal abstract fragments, which you know is really yeah, it's kind of how do we get out of this thing? But because I came a little late, so I don't know if you were, when talking about the last chapter, if you already talked about these things, but I was really struck in terms of our, current dilemma with the election and all this horrible stuff going on with the kind of thesis 218 and following in 19, where he says, imprisoned in a flattened universe bounded by the screen of the spectacle behind what his own life has been exiled, behind which his own life has been exiled, the spectator's consciousness no longer knows anyone but the fictitious interlocutors who subject him to a one-way monologue about their commodities and the politics of their commodities. So, which really seems to describe where we're at. And
yeah.
yeah, and he also says a lot of interesting things about the development of technology to be what has already been decided in advance through our systems of production and consumption. Yeah, and in 219, where he's saying that the spectacle which obliterates the boundaries between self and world, et cetera, also obliterates the boundaries between the true and false by repressing all directly lived truth beneath the real presence of falsehood maintained by the organization of appearances, which, to me really think, well, that really seems to be about all these totally seemingly insane people, things that people believe that Trump, et cetera, are saying about, open borders and crazy things going on.
Right.
Um, but yeah, and then there was one other thing I was going to mention, which I'm kind of blanking out on at the moment, but yeah.
Well, just to get the thing you just mentioned, uh, uh, we have this thing. I mean, we've had this experience that the Trump supporters, uh, uh, at least many of them, are hardly susceptible to any argument. It's obvious that their whole, you know, mind or kind of orientation is such that it's like frozen. And if somebody said, well, here's a film of Trump doing this or that, they would just say, well, that's fake. And if you start saying that everything is fake that you don't like, this is what he's talking about in that phrase, obliterating the boundary between self and world. You're also obliterating the boundary between true and false. So it's not just that there's true and false and you're confusing them. It's just that it's smushed so that you almost don't know how to logically rational, like say, well, what is evidence for this? And they say, oh, that's what so and so says. What are
Yeah, and then
if you
it's
already
like,
have a ready-made thing that just says, fuck all that. There's
right, and
nothing
the
you can say.
technology has grown to support that
Yeah,
obliteration of the boundary of truth and
exactly.
falseness by really making it literally impossible to say if something you've seen is true or false.
Yeah.
If you've seen it on the screen, which is where most people see everything these
Yeah.
days.
And as even back in the Nazis' days, they had somewhat the same thing, but just in a sort of more primitive form that just says if you just keep ranting over and over and over and over, uh, it almost doesn't matter what people believe because after a while, there's just no other option. That's all they've heard. And if you just do it over and over and over again, uh, it's not so much that you're convincing them that the Jews are bad or something like that. It's that uh, you're you're disorienting them so that they're incapable of saying, are the Jews bad? Are the Jews good? Why? What? It's just sort of glommed out there. And if they succeed in that, then they've succeeded because they've turned people into this mush that are incapable of doing anything on their own. And so the only thing they would be capable of is that if Hitler called on them to do something, then maybe they would do it. But if somebody else comes in and says, oh, Hitler is lying and I'll prove it, here's the statistics, they say, what are you talking about? So, yes. Ed.
Oh, yes. Well, my impression of these people is they're like schoolyard kids competing with each other to be more outrageous. Like the teacher has crayons coming out of its nose. No, out of its ears. No, out of its behind. Ah. Like they don't care about the truth value. It's just they're trying to get a rise out of us.
Yeah.
And they don't criticize each other for being bullshit. Because as long as you agree with them or come close to supporting their master, their playground bully in
Yeah.
chief, it'd be cool.
And there's this identity with, well, you can identify with Trump or identify with a group. And then if you identify strongly with that group that you're in, like I'm a country person or I'm, whatever it may be, uh, then it doesn't really matter. Truth doesn't matter. What matters is that you disturb the enemy, and so, I mean, I've seen people do stuff like show a truck with people riding in the back of a truck with Confederate uniforms on and Ku Klux Klan things and a few things like that. And they would gleefully say that, boy, that's going to own the libs, as if because a liberal person, like maybe somebody who knows those people, is going to say, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" And there's ha ha, shocked you, didn't we? And it is so infantile, as Debord says that this kind of identification is an infantile thing. It's that you're, but yeah,
It's a lot easier to just weaponize so-called facts than, the truth serves us. It doesn't serve them. And if the truth, if he didn't have the biggest reception when he was elected president, if that wasn't the case, the big lie, then the whole thing would fall apart. So it's just like, well, there's nothing in it there's no reason if I'm a Republican for me to critique it unless I'm a disgruntled Republican. And since we're run by a mob boss at current, I'm speaking as a Republican, then that's not going to be healthy for us. So there you go.
Yeah. Any other comments by people who haven't talked before? Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to comment, I think, about the optimism in this work. Might be a strange thing to say. I remember picking this book up when I was a teenager. It was really the first work of political theory I read, and kind of set me on my path to where I am now. Kind of interesting. But it is, as much as he's critiquing the world of capitalism, of late capitalism, his finding of the workers' councils and suggestion that it is possible to overcome the spectacle and separation, I think is very a hopeful message in a way that inspired me, at least, and I think has inspired many others to struggle against it. But also in a way, when I read the sequel to this, I think when he wrote it about 15 years later, maybe 20, that Debord himself was far more pessimistic about whether the spectacle could be overcome. And yeah, so I'm always curious about kind of the disjunction there, because he's writing this in the mid 60s with the upsurge of social movements and class struggle. And by the 80s, he seems to, I think, suggest in that other text that maybe it's, if not hopeless, just very difficult. So I like to read this because there's still some hope there, and I think he's right about the councils.
Yeah, the book Peter is talking about is called Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, which doesn't mean the book, it means the society, that he wrote in 1988, so 21 years later. And in that book, it is, I don't know that you would say this is optimistic exactly, but certainly it's boldly, right out there. And yes, in that book, he is noting some developments of the spectacle society that make it more difficult. But emphatically, he is not saying that it's walled off. He also, that book needs to be read carefully. It's sort of, it has its own little traps, mental traps and so on, which he actually describes right at the very beginning. But basically, he's saying that the spectacle has unified itself globally in a way that it was not unified in the 60s, where you had the two different kind of spectacle, concentrated and the diffuse. In 1988, he says, now there's what I call the integrated spectacle that integrates those two things, like the Stalinist Nazi kind of thing and the Western thing. The Western thing has won, he said. It was the stronger one. It's more sophisticated and it's, but it's incorporated some of these police state things of the concentrated spectacle. And so when you put those things together, it does make it more difficult. The world is more literally totally dominated. Whereas before, if you had these opposing camps, there were places in the middle that were kind of still out of bounds, and now for practical purposes, anywhere you go, you're in it. But he notes that the fact and the spectacle uses all kinds of different confusions more sophisticatedly than it used to. It used to just say, this product is good, buy it, and you could kind of debate, is it as good as that or something? But now you have so many competing different things, and you don't really know what's going on. Where did that come from? But here's the thing, even the rulers don't know. That's a key thing. He says it's one thing the ruling order has got this thing where the people in it are all kind of at a loss. You don't know what to trust, what source this. And but by the same token, they've raised themselves on this diet also. He says a society that has muddled things like that intentionally itself can no longer calculate strategically because it doesn't know what is going on. It knows some things, it knows better than the average person. Of course, we're in power, like those naive people there think they're actually voting for something or this. And, we know that we've got it all in control. But the small people at the top, themselves are competing with each other. They're trying to sabotage their rivals, like rival businesses, all this kind of stuff. And when they are, if you were to try to fantasize an ideal ruling class person or consciousness that would know how things were going and what you needed to do to head this thing off and so on, they're not very good at that because they have screwed up their own world, their own mental environment, such that they don't really know if something take something like the Occupy movement, which is minor. I'm not saying it's earth-shaking or something, but nobody knew where's that coming from. How do because they've got their rationales and their this and that, and they thought, well, if something happens here, the police will come in and it'll get nipped in the bud, and but things still turn up, like May 68 turned up, again, without apparent cause. And so that kind of stuff has become more difficult now, according to this 1988 book. But he does leave those little things, like I quoted almost literally. He said, a system that has, fudged all these things can itself no longer conduct its activities rationally because it doesn't know what the things are. It doesn't know what data to trust. It doesn't know how the data fit together. It's the people that have gone to its universities don't know how to think dialectically because they've smashed it. They've been giving lectures about how the end of ideology and there's no alternative and this kind of thing like that. And so then if an alternative crops up, they don't know what to do about it. Wait a minute, that's not supposed to be there.
So the rulers themselves are so ensconced in it
that
before, when Debord was writing this, they had some idea of the spectacle, maybe. And by the
precisely
80s,
because they were out, the spectacle didn't dominate everything. You would have little areas of life that the spectacle wasn't in. In the 19th century, for example, you would go to workers' communities or slums, i.e. But those people were not susceptible to some spectacle, really, because they were just like savages that were just there and nobody gave a shit. They were just supposed to show up to the factory and then go back to their slum. And, you know, to the extent that they did live, they had their own culture because they didn't have a culture that came out of a TV that told them to admire this kind of lifestyle or something. So such as it was pretty miserable, they were on their own, you know, and if you had come in and talked about how great capitalism was or something, they would have said, what do you mean, Joe, bloke? What's that guy doing? We know that we're getting fucked over here. You know, what are you talking about? That if we just work, well, maybe we can become a millionaire. I mean, nobody believed something like that. You
They
know,
might have done something far worse than that to
yeah.
them.
So, yeah, you're absolutely right to point out that latter book is less optimistic for sure, but it is emphatically not ruling out things. It's just saying that, well, we lost that round more or less, but the enemy is not out of it yet.
Interesting.
Thanks. Other comments or questions?
Yeah, Ken, this is Gerhard.
Gerhard, hi.
Yeah, hi. You know, I was real interested in Peter's question about where Debord went later in his life. And you'll recall that other times I've mentioned to you that I think it would add a lot if you could personalize this a little bit
Uh-huh.
and make it relate to why he, for instance, in the last years of his life was not active. We were reading some material about Sibelius today, and it apparently for the last 15 to 20 years of Sibelius's life, he sat it out. He said, I did my work. He continued to do various things, but he did a lot of drinking and he ate very well. And so I'm wondering, Guy Debord has his reputation for being somebody who bragged about being the most drinking experienced writer and less focused on actually producing writing. And I'm wondering if that relates to this. He stepped aside instead for
No.
his gift.
Yeah, he didn't. I mean, if you consider the kind of things that Debord was doing, which included writing, and it included drinking and debauchery and various other things, but he continued to, like, up until his death, you know, like the book we're talking about was 21 years later, 1988, and in 89. He published the first book of sort of quasi-memoirs. And in 1991, I think, or 89, somewhere up there, not long before he died, he published a book responding to various things that people had said about him and demolishing them, needless to say. And he was still in communication with people like in Portugal or Spain or Italy. If you read his letters, they don't, there's these fat volumes of letters, and the letters do not diminish with his old age. He's still, he's meeting people. He's, so it's not like he's stopped doing stuff.
Yeah. And how about your own personal relation to this material and his ideas? I remember years ago, you brought one of the other translators to the University Avenue.
Right.
And there was fascinating talk. You went out to lunch with him afterward.
Right.
But just what we could overhear at the table about you talking about nuances of your translations that he continued to take exception to. And it fueled my interest in knowing how you relate to the situationism, just as this issue of how he relates to situationism is a live issue when you go out looking abroad at the whole range of people talking about him and situationism. You see there's a range interpretation vary about how central his idea is and how central this book is.
Right.
And that's wonderful because you're in a perfect position to shed light on these issues.
Well, if you look at that guy's name was Donald Nicholson Smith, and the other guy that was there, I think at the same time, was Anselm Yappe, who wrote the book Guy Debord. But Donald Nicholson Smith was a member of the SI, and he's translated a lot of situationist stuff. And I've known him since the 70s. And Well, you know, when you get old, you do slow down a little bit. I'm noticing that myself. I'm almost 80, you know, and uh, so there's some things that I don't feel the urgency to, oh, let's go over and see what's going on or something like that. I'm picking my battles a little more, but I haven't become disillusioned by any means. It's just I think part of the reason I haven't become disillusioned is that I take it easy and I do choose my battles and I don't burn myself out. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to do that because if you saw some of the polemics by the hundreds that, you know, I routinely still read, you know, I mean, I see now it's usually on the web, but it used to be that there were pamphlets and leaflets floating, you know, circulating around the world, and you would have these debates and so on. It would be very easy to get OD'd because a lot of it is, you know, is not that great. And the stuff that is perceptive is mixed in with egotistical things and, you know, uh, you know, so it's easy to just say, oh man, enough of that. I'm just going to take it easy, go to a concert or read a good book or something. Uh, so I do that a lot, the latter. But I try to not burn myself out. Like I usually don't do things out of duty. And you know, like where a typical radical person thinks, well, I should do this thing, or I should contribute to this, or something. And it's kind of a slog, and it's no wonder that people get OD'd with it and say, okay, enough already. I'm sick of that. I try not to do that, and uh, I just kind of float along doing things that I'm interested in. And then every once in a while, something like the Occupy movement will come up, and then I pounce on it. You know, I notice it and say, oh, that's interesting. And a week later, oh, okay, I'm going in this. And so then I drop stuff. I'm no longer reading novels and poetry and stuff. I mean, I am just, you know, but not so much the usual stuff where I'm just kind of floating along, because it's much more interesting to engage in that way. But the reason, for me, it's more interesting because it's also fresh. I haven't been doing it every day. Oh, it's been a year since I wrote a leaflet. You know, I mean, I'm still corresponding and doing stuff like that, but so when something does come up, it's exciting, and then I go there, and you know, I ended up really being involved in the Occupy movement and writing several things about it that I think are really good. You know, I mean, I didn't just churn it out. You know, I tried to focus on things that were unique about this and spread the word. You know, like here is something. Here's what's going on here. Here are the choices. So that's fun. It's interesting. It's engaging. And I because of that, I know that Debord had exactly the same feelings, even as different a personality and culture that he's from, that he knew how to do that. And he would also, again, by the same token, in his own way, he was saying, I'm starting with me. You know, you're not going to come in here and say, I have a duty to, you know, send off so many letters or to grind out a leaflet every week, you know, to propagandize people or something. So it was when he decided to engage, you know, he would pick what is he going to focus on. And he would admit, I don't know anything about that over there. I'm not going to argue about, but here I do know something about this. I've researched this and so on. I'll give you an example about the Society of the Spectacle. You mentioned his drinking, and he almost prided himself on this, which I think is kind of silly, but he wasn't just a drunk, you know. He kind of treated it like an aesthetic thing, like he drank a lot, but he wasn't just, conked out or something like that. So anyway, he did do that regularly. Now, when he decided, like around 1966 or so, that he was going to write a book about the spectacle, he stopped drinking. And I don't know for how long, many months at least. I don't know if it was a year or something. And maybe when he says he stopped, he doesn't mean he wasn't drinking wine with dinner or something like that. But what his normal, orgiastic drinking, he stopped so that he could do this. But that wasn't a sacrifice, I mean, it was a sacrifice, you might say, but he was so hepped up, like, of the importance of this and the interest of it, that was cool. He could do it. And then when he was done with it, then he goes back to his usual, lot of drinking and other, debaucheries and so on. But it just indicates, like he had sense enough to know, okay, to do something like this, I can't just wing it. I'm going to be reading a lot. I'm going to be drafting different, all that. And he knew that was the appropriate thing there. So, but normally he had been able to function quite well while doing all this drinking and other high living. During all the editing of the Situationist journals, that wasn't any problem. But to write this particular book was an extreme challenging thing to do. And he wanted to do, I mean, as you can look, you've read the book. Now you can see there is not a word in here that has not been carefully weighed. You may not understand them all, but believe me, he threw out reams and reams of stuff and picked out this sentence. And, like we were kind of joking earlier in the meeting about his phrase where he says these sort of sub-ludic, sub-playful contests from sports to elections. And so you can look at that in this context. But believe me, to arrive at something like that little phrase, he had to throw out a lot. He said, what am I going to say about sports? Am I going to mention elections? Okay, he mentions elections one time in the book, I think, which is then. And that's he's decided, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it in a way that is brief and that almost looks flippant, because I want that tone. I don't want to say I am against voting, I'm for voting, I'm for, he wants to treat it as if this is just like this is just a little insignificant thing that you can just kind of brush away. And he knows that for many people, sports are their life. It's their only fun thing in life is rooting for a soccer team or something. And similarly for elections. So he wanted to do something that was not like an argument, you shouldn't vote or you should vote, you're only doing the blah, blah, blah. So he picks out that just one little half of a sentence to say that. And it's perfect, and of course it's going to arouse people. It's like, what do you mean election is not like a sport, it's serious? Well, yeah, it is, but he said exactly what he wanted to say about that. And in other articles or something, it would be possible that you would debate, should you vote or should you do this or, whatever. But he wasn't going there. here because it was irrelevant. He's trying to explain how the society is functioning, and how it's functioning is in this spectacular separation. That the spectacle is not just looking at images or something. It's anything, as he says, that is a disconnect. It's anything that's inhibiting you from full conscious activity, knowing what you're doing, with whom you're doing it, relating with whom you're doing it, all that. The spectacle is something that's cutting into that in some way. And so that's what he's talking about here. And to do all this, all these different slants on it, so it's like a prism, you look at it from different angles. So he stops drinking for a year or so to do it. But I know, like he has that, I know that feeling because I've had that in not comparing myself with him, but when I do get into something and I've got an idea, like, oh yes, and I go over and over, I work on something for a few months and come out with something, and frankly, usually I'm very pleased with it. When I look back 10 years later and I pick it up and I say, great, but it's because I I work like he did. My lifestyle is different, and so on. Uh, you know, I haven't had that central role that he had, but it's like uh, anyway, when you have that angle at it, this activity is very interesting, and it's not just that, oh, I will be saving people's lives or something if this has an impact. Of course, you may be mistaken. I may think this will have an impact and nobody pays any attention, or I was simply mistaken in what I was doing. But to the extent that I have some experience here and can think, okay, these are the objections and this kind of thing. There was this Darwin quote that I always liked in his autobiography. He said one thing that he had done all his life was, he said, I have noticed that when something crosses me, like contradicts what I have to say, I have noted that by the next day I've forgotten what it was. And therefore, I have taken the habit of immediately writing down anytime anything comes into my view that contradicts me, like a critique of my book, about evolution or something like this. Because otherwise, and there's that effort, like Debord did that routinely, that you look at what's coming at you and that challenges you, and you note it and you try to address it. And if you do that consistently, then, I can tell that Debord did it because there's practically never does he make a mistake. Whereas almost anybody else, you can say, well, he was just not thinking there and he kind of went off on a tangent or something. But his letters, all these different things, even his notes to himself, it's because he's really paying attention to all the possible objections, and he'll really go through them. So anyway, I think that's enough on that topic, but thank you for bringing it up. And in the film that we're going to be seeing in the next two sessions, he talks about himself. He goes over his life in his unique way. Bill. You're muted. There you
Yeah,
go.
I got it now. I was wondering about the one section where he mentions the Situationists is about the end of modern art and how Dadaism and Surrealism each have a plus, but they also have an inverse minus. And he talks about the need to abolish and realize art.
Right.
So I wonder if it led me to think there may be some situationist tactic or that would fill the bill here, because something like what he used to write about Derives, or exploring the urban surround and mapping psychogeographies,
Right.
Loosening up the congealed state of enforced by the spectacle. That he does this throughout with the determinant rhetorical maneuver that he so did he is there possibilities there is really the question.
Yeah, I would say, like, you can't put your finger on something and say, here is the realization and evolution of art in this thing that I've just created here. What you have to take those as, these are ventures. It's like, if you're dealing with life, with reality, with the social system, whatever you're dealing with, you have to become aware of the limits of the various things, such as art, philosophy, etc., that we have inherited them, that are sort of like these things out there. And you have to understand that those things are flawed. That there's something limited about them. There may be something, you might read a philosopher and find some good ideas, or you might see a work of art and be impressed by it or moved by it in some way like that. But there's also limits. And you don't have to think, what would be the magical thing that will solve this issue? Because the closest thing to a magical thing that would solve it is a global revolution, which would immediately eliminate a lot of the alienated things. And even then, you might say, well, that's not permanent, because you can still have room for things rigidifying. There's always going to be room for ideologies to develop and so on. The difference is that right now, the ideological reifications and rigidifications have a social, material, economic reality. In other words, people are imprisoned because of them. People are dying of starvation because of it. It's actually a thing. It's whereas you could have other things where a liberated global society with all sorts of different flavors that could have all kinds of disputes, and rigidifications could develop, but they wouldn't translate into this person is rich and this person is poor. That would be what they would translate to is more subtle things, like, well, that person's going to move over there where he likes the people better. People would sort of shift around. There would be debates. Shall we do this to improve the ecology or something? And, well, this person wants to do that. You still have debates and stuff. And you still have things like arts, say, like you have a picture or you have a thing that you create, but it's not like a specialty that, uh, you know, like in present day, and the artist is the specialist in creativity, and other people don't get to be very creative generally. But an artist, like somebody like Picasso, their very career is just sort of doing whatever they feel like doing. you know, and they can come up with, they can go through all sorts of different phases, their blue phase and their expressionist phase and whatever. And it's just kind of what is his mood? So it's a very privileged position, but because it's privileged, it's also separate. Picasso is not going to liberate us. You know, at the most, there can be something like you can say, well, Picasso is an example of the creativity that is in everybody, and he's just somebody who's got it all blossoming there with other people that it's been repressed when they were a little kid. So you're not going to find an easy answer. It's just these are challenges to say, how can I, if I am going to make art, know what I'm doing, know that I'm not overthrowing the system. If I am, etc. Just be aware of the limitations, and that represents a challenge. And so maybe you'll try to do it a little differently, what you do. Let's here's from some other people we haven't heard from. I'm gonna do the gallery view here just a minute here. John, we haven't heard from you. Have any remarks, questions, comments?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I was thinking about the book overall and also the time overall. This was coming out of the great World War II and everything that implied. And I think Guy Debord really got to the essence of the zeitgeist of the time. And the idea of putting it in terms of the spectacle, I find fascinating because of the visual and the imagery, even though that it's obviously more than that. And then I was thinking about how the digital, especially in the last 15, 20 years, has been superimposed on our world. And if we kind of peel it back and think, what was it like before? This was so ingrained into our lives that we could hardly think about how it would be without it. It's almost like it's been embroidered into our consciousness. And then I tried to do the same with the spectacle and tried to say, well, what was it like before this consciousness that Debord was bringing to the spectacle? And I was thinking, well, it was mostly the war. And that after the war, he was really putting together how people had maybe been very optimistic in the post-war scene, but he was kind of putting it together in a way that was much more realistic and interesting. And then it made me think of how in Japan, after the war, there was this idea that there was a complete break after World War II. And yet I was meeting people in the 80s and 90s who said, no, actually, the fascism in the war period was like hard boot fascism. And now it's a continuation of the very same society, but it's more like tennis shoe fascism. And
like
it's
what?
a little like tennis shoe fascism instead of a hard booted fascism.
Oh, okay. Instead of hard boot, like a tennis shoe. Yeah.
Yeah. So it had been kind of mild, but if you look at, for example, the way the communities were organized, even within Tokyo, there were little villages. And during the war, these associations would deal with rationing the food and other kinds of activities that were done together. And in the post-war scene, it was exactly the same group of people doing the same thing, but different activities. And yet the organization hadn't really changed. So in certain ways, there was a continuation that was kind of overlooked. And I think Debord, in a sense, was also kind of saying, like, you may all think it's all over and now we're flourishing in this great consumerist, time, but actually he was so critical in really hitting the zeitgeist of what was upside down. So I had a fabulous time reading this book. It was very difficult in some ways, but I really appreciate how you line by line went through it. And I got a lot out of it, and as well as all the discussions. And I just have one specific question on 218, which we've been over a bit today. The very last line, the spectacle as a whole is his mirror sign presenting illusory escapes from a universal autism. And I was curious what how you think he was using this word autism. Was he just saying that we're all like fucked up in a similar way, universal autism? We just
I think so. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, thanks.
I mean,
That's what I
I
wanted.
guess autism has various nuances these days, but I think wasn't the original sense is that you were just sort of not very social. You didn't really get what other people were. You were just sort of in a world of your own, or something.
Mm,
And he's saying that the lives that we live in this kind of circumstance are kind of zombie-like, like that.
mm,
You know, that uh, I mean, a typical example, just simplistic, is just the isolated person watching TV. Say
mm,
what, let's say watching a program. Actually, it doesn't make that much difference, but say it's some really dumb program. I mean, you could
mm,
be watching a Bach concert or something, and maybe that's a little different feel. That's just like listening to that's not much different than listening to a live concert. But if you're watching some really dumb program, of which there's obviously a lot, and you imagine that for the moment, that is the entire world of that person, is this person watching a show, where, oh, you won
mm,
the $100 jackpot, and yeah, you win, this quantity or so. Oh, yay! It's just so.
mm,
I mean, it's so infantile, but I mean, even dumb infantile, even children would not find that very interesting, and yet
mm,
billions of people, uh, through maybe they don't even intend to, they're just sort of, well, I don't feel like doing anything. I guess I'll turn on the tube, and then they're just sitting there for hours looking at such stuff. I mean, that deserves to be called autism, because that's really nothing much but you and idiocy meeting. And
mm.
that's your world. The announcer or something is your interlocutor. And then the ads are other interlocutors telling, oh, you're not shit unless you buy this, oh, yeah. Even
Thank
though
you.
you can't even afford to buy it, I mean, imagine consuming, I mean, imagine people consuming things like that. I mean, and you notice probably people that have something I never understood is like people that have the radio or TV, but they just have it on all the time.
Mm,
So basically, and they say, and I say, doesn't that bother you? And I say, oh, no, no, no. Yeah, I mean, they're so used to it that they're absorbing this stuff, this complete garbage is into their mind, and they're not even aware that they're absorbing it. Whereas any
mm,
normal person looking at that would cringe and say, what is this dish detergent flushed in my face, that this brand or something, what, get out of here, but for them, it's like, oh, that's normal that it goes in my brain. And,
mm,
what's the problem? I mean, that's pretty far out if you think about it. Okay, that's
mm,
an extreme simplistic thing. Obviously, most people, even the most zombified, do more than just do, they've got to get up and
mm,
eat dinner and go to work or go out to do something or something, but even so, there's an awful lot of that, that is,
mm,
by any objective standard is really sick, and that's the world that we live in,
mm,
and we may pride ourselves on saying, well, I wouldn't do that, I mean, I only turn it on for good programs, or, I watch the classical concert, or I watch this thing or that, but basically a lot of it has the same function. We're watching something and it kind of soothes us, like the quiz show or something might soothe
mm.
other person. Um, so yeah, anyway, I think I don't think the autistic thing is an exaggeration.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me see here. Bruce, haven't heard anything from you. Got any comment or questions?
Well, the thing that has perplexed me about this book and about the situations in general, constantly, in fact, is the disconnect between the critique of society that's in this book and in effect the advocacy of a society where the proletariat takes complete control over their destiny and through the organization of workers' councils and direct democracy with the workers effectively and with labor effectively empowered and how to and the day-to-day reality of things that are happening and what to do in the interim while seeking to get to the point where you achieve that end goal. I get, I've always been perplexed by that, and I remain perplexed by that by even going through this book for the second time in my life.
Well, I think like I answered Judy, I believe it was, about what would be real life. And I think that we have senses of what we would like to do as an individual, and also some senses of what would be logical or rewarding things for other people to do generally. And you don't want to make a big jump between this realized democracy and workers' councils and this kind of stuff, and a present in which nothing is happening. Because obviously, a present where nothing much is happening is not going to get there. And I wouldn't have any idea, like, well, first you've got to go over here, and then you do this and this and this. It doesn't work that way. What it works for is, as individuals, you and I and other people try to make some sense of our lives and try to figure out personally, like, do I want to do this? Do I want to get that job? Do I want to go to school there? Do I want to take a vacation at this point? Do I want to have a relation with that person? We've got all these decisions here that have little or no direct connection with big pictures, like, are we going to have a revolution tomorrow or in 50 years? It's just like, what am I going to do? And we do those things. And in the process of doing those things, we make mistakes. We learn from them. We meet other people who are doing similar things. We compare notes. We realize that when things that might have worked well yesterday don't work quite the same today because the circumstances have changed, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, that's the world we're in. We're not in a world that lacks workers' councils and we need to hop there some magical way. We're in a world that has these different problems, these limits, contradictions. And our first step is to start from ourselves. And like the first most minimal thing is like I think of the Situationists back in the times where they were inventing derives and stuff like that, early 50s. Basically, they were sort of ne'er-do-wells who were avoiding work if possible and kind of bohemian types in Paris. And they were saying, like, what's interesting to do? And whereas the ordinary person might say, oh, let's go see a movie or let's do this, a lot of these kind of interests were not very interesting for them. And so such interests as they did have, it was like, well, I'm dissatisfied with this. Let's just take a walk here. let's just stroll around because that's kind of a pleasant thing to do regardless. You know, it's and they end up, oh, that's interesting, and little by little they come up with the idea of treating it as an exploration, like if they were exploring a new continent or something, you know. But that came out of starting from themselves, like, what are we going to do tonight? Not why aren't workers, how are we ever going to get to workers' councils? That's a silly thing to think about, you know, because you're not even remotely close there. It's like right now, I'm just here with one or two other people. What are we going to do tonight? I want to do the, nah, that doesn't sound very interesting. What if we go over there? No, I don't like that place. I like that neighborhood, but okay, let's go over to that neighborhood. Let's go over to that bar on the other side of town. I mean, it could be very minimal things, but they're deciding what they're going to do. And then when they do this a little bit, they talk with each other. It says, you know, this whole world is fucked up. Yeah, no, no shit, Sherlock, you know, and da da da. But what do you want to do about it? Well, uh, other people propose things to do about it, like join the Communist Party, vote for the socialists, you know, and they are in a position where they're saying, forget it. That is bullshit. You know, they had enough sense to that that's not doing anything. That's the last thing they want to do. It's of no interest. And so they look at what are the things of interest. Well, here's a little thing I've been fiddling around with, you know, and they're doing some kind of arty thing or a poetic thing or something like that. And somebody says, oh, that's just poetry, you know. So the point is they're looking at their own lives and they're figuring out where to go from there. And it's only after they do that for a while that a few of them, like Debord and Shegloff and one or two others, you know, will think, hey, you know, what we've been doing here is kind of a first step in doing, you know, instead of just wandering around, let's sort of treat it a little bit more seriously. Let's start writing up our discoveries. And then in the process of doing that, we may figure out what it is we've been doing. Before then, we were just taking a stroll, like people do. But now we're taking a stroll. Why are we doing that? Well, we're exploring a city. Why are we exploring a city? Because the city is where we live. And what is the deal about exploring it? Well, mostly it's not very cool. You know, it's ugly buildings and, you know, places where people have to go to work and offices and factories and stuff like that. Pretty ugly. But there are, in little niches here or there, kind of interesting things. You may run into an interesting person, you know, in this different area, whatever. And so they do these things, and some of them just do those things. And then they phase away like a lot of bohemians do. They drink themselves to death or they go to jail for petty theft or something, you know. But there's a few people who are saying, looking a little farther beyond just sort of their immediate thing. And out of that, several years of that came the Situationist International. And it came after they had broken up from some of their friends and met new people and so on. And little by little, they start taking on more stuff. They thought, you know, we're talking about how we don't like this world here. What is, you know, what is it we're looking for? Are we looking for, you know, a revolution? Well, there have been these revolutions like in Russia, and that didn't work out very well. I don't want something like that. Well, yeah, there was this thing in Spain. Yeah, well, it was defeated. Yeah, but nevertheless, it was not like Russia. So let's look into that a little bit. You know, maybe there were some interesting things there. And then they're thinking about, well, what about the arts? Well, let's go back and look at the Dadaists and Surrealists. They had some pretty interesting things, you will agree. We've grown up with that, and we can see that they're limited now. They just end up in museums, but there's some stuff to be learned there. So let's look into that. And then maybe we can do stuff with that that they didn't do, so we can avoid that blind alley. So the point is, that's where you need to be focused. If you're focused on some distant thing, like how are we going to get to workers' councils when we can't even get to unions, or, well, of course you're going to be depressed and say, well, gosh, this is impossible. But the possible things come up when a certain number of people don't take no for an answer. They start looking for the so-called impossible and say, well, we don't have it now, so I have enough sense to realize that. But what can I do? And maybe in the process of choosing these small things that I can do and meeting other people who are in the same boat, then little by little, you come up with some stuff that I can't do alone, but maybe 10 of us together can do something. What? Maybe a little scandal, maybe some kind of propaganda for something, maybe some creative thing, maybe something just for the hell of it, just a wacky prank or something. But whatever it is, it's things that people are looking for what they want to do and learning from the impediments that they come upon. So that's all that the situationists were ever doing. It's just that at a certain point, after doing this for several years, they can start making generalizations about bigger things. They can start looking back at history and saying, we can conclude from this that the Russian Revolution was not the way to go. We can conclude that the Spanish Revolution did have some interesting things that maybe could be suggestive. But they also had some problems. We can conclude that the Dadaists had some interesting things. Blah, blah, blah. We can conclude that riot over in the neighboring thing there, even though it looks kind of chaotic, was sort of going in the right direction. Maybe we can talk to them, and say, why were you doing this? Or look into it. And so they end up spreading out so that they start looking around things that are actually happening, not just being dreamed about, actually happening in the world, and saying, what's the interesting thing here? What's the problems with it? And then a very interesting thing to do is just to state that, or to write it down and to say, here is an interesting thing. The blacks of Watts have rioted. What do we think about that? Well, it's an understandable reaction for sure. And we kind of approve. I mean, we don't give a shit if they burn down a supermarket or something like that. So what are we, but do they know why they were doing it? Well, they're sort of doing it impulsively. We don't, so then they can do things like Debord did, like let's write a little article or a little pamphlet. Here is what we see is going on in Watts. And then to take it there, then you want to do it so that ideally people in Watts or people in similar places would see, aha, people have been treating this as if it's insane, but there is a kind of logic to it. So anyway, this was a long answer to your question. But to me, there is not this division. I don't waste time thinking about workers' councils and stuff, unless if May 68 came into our society, then I would start thinking about workers' councils, because they would then start being a practical option. But right now, I don't think about that. I think, what are people doing here? And then I can maybe say something about that. And that's all the Situationists, that's all that Debord was ever doing. There's no disconnect there. They were talking about their own lives and the possibilities. And end of speech. Thanks for bringing that up.
Okay. In other words, you're kind of saying that develop a critique based on what's you see happening around you.
Yes. Again,
And
if you find that interesting, you know, I mean,
and that the logic of that critique could lead to the longer term objective.
yes. I mean, it's hard to imagine the longer term objection happening if some people weren't doing the more preliminary things,
Of course,
you know.
of course. But
So,
in other words, you got to develop a critique which kind of ties together these different things happening in different places and shows a common thread
yeah,
running through them that is intrinsically emancipatory.
yeah. And of course, you may be mistaken. You may think you're explaining what they're doing, and they look at it and they say, "What the fuck are you talking about? That's not what we're doing," or something. They may be mistaken too, but they may rightly say that no, you were misunderstanding this or something. So then you have to get back to the drawing board. But the point is that it's only on that terrain that you're likely to ever make any progress. And by doing that, then you're going to meet other people. You're going to debate different strategies and so on. Did that work? Did that not work?
What that means in practical terms is a form of networking.
Yeah. But again, you never want to stop. Networking alone may be an obstacle. Like if you're just networking all the time, maybe you never do anything. But yeah, generally speaking, networking. In other words, you're communicating with others actively.
Networking as a practical outcome of these things you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, it's a way of saying communicating in a extensive manner, multifaceted manner. Yeah, and again, that's when you read some of the early or late SI articles, a lot of times they repeatedly say our task or the task of a revolutionary organization or something is to bring these grasping, groping actions together with understanding of those actions, or to bring diverse actions together so they can kind of compare notes. Right now, they're separated. There's somebody in a university who knows all about Hegel and can spout this or that, and then there's somebody in Watts that doesn't know how to read.
Or more like seeking a convergence.
Yeah. So, and then when the convergence comes in, the contradictions fly too. It's not necessarily smooth. You may run into a bunch of debates or a bunch of fights in one way or the other, but at least you're communicating and you're debating in the real world. Does this work? Does this speak to people? And if people say, "Oh, that does ring a bell," and if they don't say it, then the communication, at least temporarily, didn't do anything. But again, sometimes the communication can be true, but it may take a little while to percolate out there. And then 10 years later, people look back and say, "Oh,
one thing this would necessitate would be a lot more discussion groups like this.
For example, yeah." But again, if you had a lot of them, sometimes that might just bore people. So it's not, it's not necessarily a solution. But
depends
I
on
would,
what the
yeah, I would think that
depend on what the content of the discussions are.
Right, exactly. And let me look in the chat here. Okay. I'm going to go down here. We have some questions. Must know how to wait. Did Debord mean that the ideas of the SI might take a long time to be understood by the society? Yes. And then Mike made an answer there. Workers understanding this, da, da, da. Right. Ed also asks, with the integrated spectacle, a lot of these things are accepted as normal and that they just need some improvement. Yes, and that makes our task harder because it would be more helpful if people recognize that working and paying for things is not normal, but that may take a little while because the whole society is geared to making those things seem normal, and there doesn't seem like there's any alternative. And at the same time, more childish traits have been displayed, love for junk food, video games, narcissistic traits. How can a society like this no longer having wake up? Good question. So again, that's what the situationists were trying to do, has to do with waking people up. But waking people up is not enough to shout like, you are wrong, you are fucked up, read this. In fact, Marx himself said that wasn't the way to go about it. He said, we're not telling the world or the people in the world, this is what you need to do. We are just telling the world, this is what is happening. And because of the way the world is, you are going to be obliged to confront this, whether you like it or not. So all I'm doing is like saying, I'm describing the world. I'm describing your situation. I'm even describing things you do and how they work in this situation. Like if you tried to have a strike and it didn't work, I'm explaining, well, see, that didn't work because of blah, blah, blah. So maybe next time you will look at that and let's see. They were also, okay. And Mike says, anyone who wants to network with me can send me a Facebook request. So anyway, you can look in the chat if you're interested in that. So I think we're nearing the end here. We got a little bit of a late start, so it's okay to run over. Are there no final comments or questions? So for the next 2 meetings, we'll be watching Debord's last film, in Girum, imus, nocte, et consumimur, igni, which is an autobiographical film about 100 minutes long. And so we'll watch it in 2 parts, just like we watched the Society of the Spectacle film, which was a little shorter a few months ago. And then we'll do that in the same way. And I'll be sending you a link so that you can look at the film ahead of time. A dubbed version of this film is online using my translation. And so I'll look forward to hopefully seeing you here in the next 2 weeks from now. And thank you for your questions and comments. And I will stop the recording. Okay. So I'm going to say farewell to you. 3, 2, 1, going, gone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Ken.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks.